I'm thrilled to present this interview with William J. Federer, American historian, author, and former evangelical pastor. I encountered Bill's work in another podcast. He was interviewed to discuss the true history of Thanksgiving. I was astonished because it's the exact same story my dad had always told me, but I kind of took it with a grain of salt, to be honest, until hearing this famous historian tell the exact same narrative. And I had to reach out. So I reached out asking if he might be open to meeting with me and telling me what he had heard. And I even double checked another one of my dad's stories, which includes the first arrest in US history. Yeah, he told me that the first guy to ever be arrested from US territory, so technically by the British Crown, but during the era where America was first forming. And yeah, I'm related to the guy. So that might not surprise anybody, but the story is quite compelling, and I really hope that this interview is as inspiring a narrative as it has been for me. It kind of highlights the truth about our most simple nature, our propensity to express gratitude for the most simple things, life and one another. Thank you again for being here. Enjoy. I'd also like to acknowledge that we encountered some unexpected technical errors. The camera cut out. Kind of consistently did this around the 12-minute mark, if you noticed in the other interview. So we lose video but sustain audio, which is why you'll be able to continue listening. But briefly we cut out. Sorry, the camera just kind of stopped. Thanks again.
Welcome. Today we have Bill Federer with us. We are here to discuss the true history of the first American Thanksgiving. I have honestly been told my whole life a story from my father that I didn't believe was true until I heard this man share the story years ago. And it's truly a dream come true to be in person, confirming some things that were just said on the couch with me. So step one of that is that back when the pilgrims were first settling in America, we hear very different things. And of course, there was potentially not every day was pleasant, but we had an opportunity where a native had fallen so severely ill that without reaching out for help, he might not have enjoyed a recovery. So even though it was a huge risk to reach out to the white man, the European man, and seek healing, they took that risk. And what I love to hear you say is that the unspoken text of that is that if he failed, he probably would have lost his life. If Edward Winslow, who was asked to heal the chief, wasn't successful, who knows what would have happened. And I apologize, I should probably be letting you tell this, but just to round out, he did in fact successfully heal the native chief. And after that, they had their full bounty. It was harvest time. So they chose to celebrate their beautiful enjoyment of health. I mean, everybody's doing well, let's feast. The men thought that they wouldn't get along. They thought that they were going to go look back and they would be fighting and squabbles and all sorts of turmoil, and there wasn't. They double check on them again the next day, and they're still getting along. They extended the feast day after day, and the first Thanksgiving, correct me, was it 4 days straight?
Well, it was 3.
3, okay, sorry.
And we compare it to Virginia.
Okay.
So Virginia started 14 years earlier, and they had lots of Indian problems. You had a couple Indians killed. You had Pocahontas. She was a young girl, and she'd wander into the camp. Well, they kidnapped her, thinking to hold her hostage to make the chief Powhatan, make a peace agreement. And, she ended up became a Christian. She was baptized. They had an end of that. But there were there was in 1622 almost a massacre. So you had the Indians planning on massacring the entire Jamestown, Virginia settlement. One young Indian named Chunko basically told the settlers about it. They were able to defend themselves. And the Pilgrims didn't have that problem.
Yeah.
And the Pilgrims didn't, primarily because they were very sincere Christians and they wanted to uh, be at peace with the natives. Um, and and Edward Winslow was a key part of that. He, as you mentioned, the chief was Massasoit, and he had fallen ill. He's the chief that the first Thanksgiving. So you had 102 pilgrims. Half of them died the first winter. They probably would not have survived. Out of the woods in 1621 March, you have Squanto, who speaks to them in perfect English. And you're like, oh, where did this come from?
Learned from the fishermen, right?
Well, that was Samoset, his
Oh.
friend. But the Pilgrims were religious, but others weren't.
Okay.
And so you had a century of Spanish gold and pirates robbing the Spanish gold. So Potosi, silver mine in Peru, and they have the gold and silver through Portobello, Panama, ship it to Cuba, ship it to Europe, and you would have French, Dutch, and English pirates. Henry Morgan, the French pirate Leclerc, who was nicknamed Peg Leg because he had his leg blown off. And it was serious business. Peg Leg had like 100 pirate ships in his pirate fleet.
Oh, wow.
This was like
Covering
major
some
operation
serious,
going
yeah.
on. And so some of the pirates were also involved in slavery. And they would go along the coast, lure unsuspecting Indians onto the boat, lock them below deck, and take them to Malaga, Spain, which was a slave trading city. So you had the Muslim control Spain for 700 years, and they enslaved about 1 million Europeans. Well, they drove the Muslims out, but the slave port continued, and they would sell people into slavery. And so when word came to Malaga that they had Native Americans, the monks made a big stir and says, "How dare you?" And they made so much of a stir that they said, "Fine, fine, here, take them." And then the monks gave them their freedom. That's when Squanto hitchhikes his way across Europe to England. He works odd jobs, learns the English language. He's there for a dozen years, finally finds some fishing business that's going to Newfoundland. They drop him off, and then they drop him off at the coast of Cape Cod, where his Powix tribe was from, and only to find his entire tribe is dead. A French ship had shipwrecked at Cape Cod 3 years earlier. William Bradford said the sailors got ashore, and the Indians never left watching them and dogging them till they got the advantage, killed them all but 3 or 4, whom they sent from one Sachem Indian chief to another, making sport with them, using them worse than slaves. Anyway, one of them must have had an illness. The Indians had no immunity, wipes out the tribe. And so Squanto's dropped off only to find his whole tribe is dead. Now, in a backward sense, had he not been kidnapped, he most certainly would have died during that plague. Nevertheless, he's living with this neighboring Wampanoag tribe, and that's the winter that the Pilgrims come. Half of them die, and then in the spring, Squanto comes into their Plymouth settlement, and he goes, "Oh, you guys from London? Yeah, I used to live there." So, "Oh yeah, St. Paul's Chapel, oh Wharf Street, oh yeah, I know that place." And then he goes, "This place, I know it's like the back of my hand. I grew up here. So over the hill, there's a spring," and he taught them how to fish. They said, "We tried fishing." He goes, "No, these are salmon. They spawn. I'm looking at the moon. You got a couple of weeks in April. This river will be packed. You'll be harvesting fish." And they said, "You got to plant corn." They go, "We tried." He goes, No, you take dead fish, put it over the kernel, cover it with mud, keep the wolves away for 2 weeks, and then the fish decomposes. And they taught him how to take the corn and put it on the pot and make popcorn, right?
So they did work together. There was some peace and collaboration between the natives and the Pilgrims.
And Squanto was their interpreter.
Okay.
So they had a step up where other instances they didn't have an interpreter.
Right.
Squanto taught him how to catch eels and clams.
Now, do you think he could have convinced them to do that? Or do you think they could have convinced Squanto to be that friend if he didn't in his own heart want to help them?
Right, yeah, he could have just lived with the other tribe.
Right.
But William Bradford said he was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. And he refused to leave them.
Wow.
Until he died. He taught him how to catch beaver. And William Bradford says, neither was there a man among them who had even seen a beaver skin until shown by Squanto. And it was 40 years worth of beaver skins that they used to pay off their debt
Right,
for
for
the
the
boat ride.
ship. Yeah, that's so
And
wild.
but so the first Thanksgiving, Squanto was able to help interpret, and 90 Indians show up. There's only 50 pilgrims,
Wow.
right? So there's twice as many Indians at the first Thanksgiving than there were pilgrims.
Yeah.
And there were only 4 pilgrim women alive, because like 15 of them
Wow.
had died during the winter, because they would give their clothes and their food to the kids and the others, and the Indians showed up with 5 deer, and then they had turkey, and so it was a wonderful event. At the end of the day, Indians roll up in their fur skins and go to sleep on the ground. The next day they're still there. Okay, well, Thanksgiving for 2 days, and then it went on for 3 days. And
I love that. It
but
kind of was a turning point too, because wasn't there, what is it, 50 years of peace that were enjoyed after that?
right, so Edward Winslow, when Chief Massasoit fell ill, Edward Winslow decided to use his what rudimentary knowledge he had about healing to go in there and doctor him, and the Chief Massasoit recovered. The fine print was that if you doctor an Indian chief and they die, you die. It's like, okay, if the fine print's pretty important here, right? And Edward Winslow was their person that would go back and forth to England like 7 times, and he would bring back supplies. He brought the first cattle to the settlement, right? Because there was no native cattle in America. The Spanish brought some, but they were out west in Texas. But he brought them there. He got in trouble because he was the governor. William Bradford was the governor for most of 30 years, but you had a couple others that would fill in. And so Edward Winslow was a governor for like 3 different times within there.
I've read about
and
this.
then he was like an assistant governor. So as the governor, and they didn't have an Anglican priest with them. So who's going to do the marriages? Well, so Edward Winslow performed the weddings. And
this is another story my dad told me and I didn't believe.
Well, he goes back to England and he gets arrested for it because he was not an ordained Anglican minister, and it was illegal for him to perform these weddings without being authorized by the king. So they put him in jail.
It's so wild. And he wouldn't have gotten caught if he didn't need more supplies, right? He was like restocking up for the colony.
Yeah.
He had no idea that he was going to get in trouble when he went home.
Oh, yeah. And in the English prisons, they didn't feed you. You had to have some friend that missed you that would bring you food. And they had the horrible Newgate prison where so many people died there. I mean, they didn't have like windows and climate control. It was just, some bars, and then there's outdoors. And so you'd be shivering in the wintertime. And so he was in there for maybe a year or more. But the role that he played was key in going back and forth. One of the trips he was on, there were 2 ships filled full of 800 pounds of beaver skin and dried fish, and they were making their way back to England for trade. And Edward Winslow was on the big ship while they were sort of towing the smaller ship, and then a Turkish man of war, a Muslim ship, comes up and captures the ship they were towing. Wow. And takes the crew and the ship to Morocco and sells them into slavery. So Edward Winslow missed being made a slave. And so in Morocco, you had this sultan, and he had captured nearly 25,000 Europeans. They would raid the coast of Italy and Spain and France. And for centuries, in 846 AD, 11,000 Muslims invaded Rome. Wow. And trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's. So that's when Pope Leo decided to build a 39-foot wall around the Vatican. So if you go to Italy and Rome, you see this big wall around the Vatican. Well, that came from the Muslims invading Rome. And so they would raid the coast and take these people. So the Sultan had nearly 500 wives and 1,042 children. Supposedly that's some record. But he was brutal. He'd hunt his own servants just for, hey, what are we going to do today? And they captured a ship from Portugal and had a nice jeweled hatchet. And he tried it out on one of his slaves. It hacked him to death. I mean, this guy was cruel. And but that's where they took the pilgrim ship. So Edward Winslow was this close
Yeah.
to going down
There's
there.
so many elements of the story, and I don't want to take too long, I apologize, but there's so many elements that are like that. I mean, Squanto is like this divine gift that he could have chosen not to be participatory. If they didn't hit the shoals off of Cape Cod and they went to Jamestown instead, I mean, so much of this is kind of like the element of what's unexpected and the way kind of God weaves together those missing pieces for people. I do have a question for you related to Christianity. As much as we discuss it as this unified mission and this, organized religion and something that it feels like there's a clear message and a clear body for people to kind of subscribe to when they are a Christian. But would you agree that part of what the Pilgrims were fighting for was that independent relationship with God, that freedom to have a personal relationship, to be able to have their own prayers, and to practice their faith in a way that felt true for them?
Yeah, so it goes back to love. So God loves you and he wants you to love him back. For love to be loved, it must be voluntary. If you're saying you believe something because you're afraid the king's going to take you out and back and burn you at the stake, it's like, yeah, I believe. Well, you really don't believe. You just don't want to be burnt at the stake. It's an outward thing. It could be fear, it could be obedience, could be lots of things, but it's not love.
Oh, that's so sacred.
And so the founders understood that for our response to God to be a lover, it must be voluntary. What does that mean? That means you don't get any extra benefits for being a Christian, but you don't get any extra punishments for not being a Christian, right? And so there's this idea that we want to remove both the positives and the negatives, so it's just an appeal to your heart, but we want the freedom to be able to preach it. And so that concept was sort of foreign in Europe. You did have the poor Franciscan preaching friars, from St. Francis on.
Well, religion can be used to manipulate people so much. So it almost feels like until the Mayflower Compact and until this shift, the how do you reference it? The polarity change on our planet. That I think is what was really accomplished there. That was so beautiful.
No, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
In several of my books, I go through. So the default setting was the king was over everything. Caesar, he was over Nebuchadnezzar. He was over the government, and he was over whatever religion there was.
Yeah.
Here's the Nebuchadnezzar saying, "Bow to my statue, or I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace." Yeah. So, and the kings of Europe, whatever the king says, you got to believe what he tells you to believe. And then you had like a 1,000-year struggle with the Catholic Church wanting to break away control of the church from underneath the king. So now you have the church under the Pope and the king over the government, and they would battle. So the king would say, "I want to appoint the bishops." And the Pope would say, "Well, I'm going to excommunicate you if you do that." So they would sort of go back and forth.
Bunch of bureaucracy.
Well, then the church flipped from a top down to a bottom up with the congregational model of church government that's drawn from where Jesus says, "Upon this rock I'll build my ecclesia," my body, the calling out. There were 6,000 citizens in Athens, and they would be called out of their home to the marketplace, and there was no king telling them what to do. It would just be, "Hey, I noticed we got to fix the wall," and "Hey, I noticed we got to, get our navy up into speed." And so the congregational church government switched the church from top down to bottom up, but the government was still top down by the king. What the Pilgrims did is they took the bottom up church government and they made it the bottom up civil government.
That's so brilliant. And I love what you said about the freedom that, for love to be true, it needs to be voluntary. And they kind of demanded and created an infrastructure or a land where they could practice that.
Yeah, so so that was one of the key things in almost all the colonial charters. And so they all fled here for freedom of conscience. Now, some of them, when they got here, they didn't necessarily grant that same freedom to people that believed differently than they did.
Right.
So they'd tar and feather each other, chase each other out of each other's colonies, but then they all had to work together against the King of England during the Revolutionary War. And their attitude after the war was, well, we may not always agree on religion, but you were willing to fight and die for my freedom. I need to let you practice your faith. And so that's when you had the different Christian denominations tolerating each other. Their fear was the federal government would do what every other government in the world had done, and pick one denomination and make it the national one.
Right.
So England was Anglican, Scotland was Presbyterian, Holland was Dutch Reformed, Northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Italy, Spain, France, Austria, Poland Catholic. But it was one denomination in every country in Europe. Their thought is, okay, the biggest denomination in America are the Anglicans, who now are called Episcopalians once we split from the king.
Right.
So the biggest denomination was Episcopalian. Second biggest denomination was Congregationalist. And so the thought was circulating that, gee, maybe these two groups are going to get together and make themselves the favored ones. Yep. But yet you have, these other different colonies, like Rhode Island being Baptist and Pennsylvania being Quaker. And they're like, we don't want some federal denomination to come in. And so they made a First Amendment that was twofold. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That means neither for nor against. Yeah. It means hands off.
Right.
And Congress shall not prohibit the free exercise thereof. Oh. So they can't pick one denomination over the other, and they can't interfere with the free exercise of religion within the states. So the states, like a racetrack with 13 lanes, they advance religious freedom at different speeds.
Right. Okay.
So Pennsylvania was way out in front.
Yeah.
The Quakers, they were super tolerant. You had Rhode Island was Baptist, and it was pretty tolerant. Maryland had started Catholic, but it was real tolerant, sort of pioneered tolerance. But some of the states, namely Massachusetts and Connecticut, they required you to be a Congregationalist Christian up until 1818 in Connecticut and 1833 in Massachusetts. So they were still wanting to have established in their own state. Yeah. But then as you had an Irish potato famine, millions of Irish Catholics come to America. And that's when the states began to say, okay, we're going to, instead of requiring you to be a Protestant, we'll just require you to be a Christian. We think of that as narrow-minded. They felt that was generous because by saying just Christian, it could be Catholic or Protestant. And then there's a persecution of Jews in Bavaria, and 250,000 Jews come to America in the early 1800s, and they go from 0.1% to 1%. The time of the founding, 3 million people in America, a 98% Protestant, 1% Catholic, only 30,000 Catholics in a country of 3 million, and 3,000 Jews, 0.1% of the country, 7 synagogues in the whole country. But after the persecution of Jews in Bavaria, Ashkenazic Jews came over, they went from 0.1% to 1%. So that's when different states said, okay, we're going to switch from requiring you to be a Congregationalist to being a Protestant, to being a Christian. Now we're going to say all you got to do is believe in God. And then after the Civil War, many states rewrote their constitution just to make sure there was no slavery, but they would say all you got to do is believe in God. And then they began to expand it to people that believed in other religions. And in some of the states, believe it or not, they outlawed citizenship to Chinese. Like, why Chinese? Well, they're Buddhist. We don't want to be one nation under gods, plural. But then finally they got tolerated. Then they finally tolerated the atheists. They tolerated everybody. And now, ironically, it seems like everybody's tolerated except the Christians that came up with the idea. So when people say, well, you Christians are intolerant, it's like, I think the Christians are the ones that came up with the idea of tolerance.
Wow,
America was not founded by Islamists trying to figure out how to tolerate non-Islamists. Right. It wasn't tolerated by atheists trying to figure out how to tolerate non-atheists. It was founded by Christians that didn't get along. Wow. And they finally had to learn how to work together against the king during the revolution, and they began to tolerate each more and more and more. And you drop the pebble in the pond, the ripples go up. So
that's so brilliant. I think that's a beautiful place to close. I'm so thankful for your insight and your wisdom and your ability to see both the path that America has taken. And I think with your insight, I think you could probably help us carve an even better future. So thank you.
Well, it is just the last thought. What makes America great is it's a bottom-up form of government versus top-down. Rather than having a king, a pharaoh, a Caesar, or a Kaiser, or a dictator ruling through mandates and executive orders and canceling people that don't want to surrender their conscience to the government, America's founders said, no, let's trust the people. Yep. They may make mistakes, but let's trust them, have it be more of a populist with the idea that if you have preachers and teaching, doing to others as you'd have them doing to you, you'd have people treating each other nice, you'd have order, jury of your peers. But the idea was that the founder said, look, we've been down the king route. The King of England was the most powerful king on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Sun never set on the British Empire. He was a globalist. He was a one world government guy. And they're like, we've been down that road. Let's try the people. They may make mistakes, but let's at least give them a chance. So America is an experiment of a bottom up, we the people, versus top down.
I love it. I'm so thankful for your wisdom and your willingness to share this with me and whoever might see it from here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I really am so thankful. I don't know how the timing was for you. A couple times I'm like, oh, this is probably taking longer than he thought.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
I didn't really do my actual plan at all, but you are so brilliant. I can't imagine how much information is actually inside your mind.
Oh, you're kind. You're
Thank
kind.
you.
Oh, well, I'm pleased with all that you're doing. My oh my.
I feel like I'm not doing anything, but I want to connect you with people. Have you ever heard of? I mean, I know your network's probably insane. Have you ever heard of Maine Stands Up?
No.
So right when the COVID lockdown started, there's a psychiatrist and a gynecologist in Yarmouth, Maine, which is where my family's from and where anyway, 2 doctors in Maine decided something's fishy. We need to start meeting in private because these mandates and this vaccine push is so weird. So they started doing bonfires in the yard and it spread. Now they do meetings all around Maine.
Wow.
I started meeting them and joining them, and they've been meeting, like, it got to a point where there would be police every week at our meeting. They would just sit in the parking lot. They wouldn't come in. They wouldn't stop us. I don't know if they could have. But we would just get in there and discuss things that we were seeing come up in the news and question them openly.
I love it.
I know for a fact that they would. I think I found the Flyover Conservative podcast through that group, which is how I found your content.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm sure I want to connect all the dots.
David
I don't know
and
if you'd ever
Stacey.
travel to Maine, but I'm like, if you came and spoke at an MSU event, you would.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Enliven everybody, I'm sure.
I've been to Maine numerous times. I was there just last year in Bangor.
Oh, nice.
At a Calvary Chapel church.
Very cool.
Pastor Ken Graves.
Okay.
He's big, muscly guy, tattoos, and he's got this really deep voice. And I mean, he's just a really powerful pastor. I love his church because they they have the sanctuary, but they take out all the chairs. It's a gymnasium.
Oh, wow.
So then they have the during church they have the bleachers, right? So you can sit on the floor or sit in the bleachers. But then they have on either side of the stage, where they have the church service. One side is a prayer room, the other side is a weight room.
Wow, that is next level.
I mean, because it's a gym, but I mean,
right.
And so it's like all the men are like, they're pumped. They're
well, to connect them too. I mean, I feel like you should be able to appreciate God and work out.
Well, and then he has a program where guys that get in trouble with the law, they can be sentenced to working with them, and they have the dorms
nice.
for the men, and they have the dorms for the women, and then they
like actual correction.
Yeah, but it's sort of it's not security. It's whatever the level is where that if they work within the program, then they can graduate out of it quicker, and
Nice.
And they get but they it's disciplined where they get up a certain time and pray and everything. But then at the church service, it's like, okay, all the rows on this side, those are all the men from the program, and they're all paying attention, and they're all like, wanting to get their. And then one of them was like a pastor on staff. He goes, "Oh yeah, I went through that program." It's like I was one of those guys.
Wow.
And now he's a pastor on staff. So
that's amazing. That tells you it works, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I loved what you said in there as well about how sometimes just having, like with COVID, people losing the element of the church, just like being around people, there's a stressed mother and there's an older woman in the church who says something. And what you were describing about, just lower spirits and higher spirits and people being able to fill each other up. I'm like, that's what I've been experiencing just in one night here. So thank you.
Yeah, it's less structured, but more allowing the Holy Spirit to move. And to me, I think that's the way the early church was.
Yeah, definitely.
And when you think of it, for 3 centuries,
mm-hmm.
the early church met in catacombs. So I went to school in Rome and college, and we toured the catacombs. They literally tunneled underground. Whoa. They would have passageways. we're outside of the Vatican City, in Rome, and you're going down this little road. And there's like hills, and there's like this little iron gate, and the tour guide like opens it. And it's rusty, and it opens up, and it's like 4 feet high. You got to scouch down, and you scoot back like 30 or 40 yards on this like, and then it opens up into a space that's maybe a 20 by 20, and there's first century Christian graffiti on the ceiling, and candle and torch marks, and little niches and passageways that goes down. But they would literally meet in secret because of the Romans, and that was the Christian experience. So you were small groups. You were people that every time they got together, they were risking their lives to get together. Very intimate, very caring, and then once Constantine stopped the persecution, which was great, but everybody came out of the catacombs, and then Constantine's like, well, hey, I'm going to get rid of paganism, but we got these leftover big, marble basilicas is what they call them, and so let's have church in there. And so within one generation, you got these little kids going from risking their lives to this big marble building, and then there's a couple of heresies, and then they have consuls to settle the heresy, and then it's not just the religious doctrine, but now it's the state-approved doctrine, because Constantine made Christianity the default religion for the Roman Empire.
Right.
So now, and then you get Theodosius in 379 AD. He's a Christian Roman emperor that outlaws paganism. Right. So in Greece, you had a bunch of pagans that didn't want to convert, and so he sends an army over there to conquer them, and Saint Ambrose like rebukes Emperor Theodosius, but nevertheless, it happened. So now you have this flood of nominal Christians into the church saying, I believe whatever the state-approved doctrine is. They've never had a heart change, and it's just this big marble building. It's all formal. And so just within 1 century, you go from this intimate small group to this sort of sterile, experience. And but so what you're talking about is that original, intimate, close relationship, and you don't just pray with people. You say, I'm going to be there for you.
Right.
Like, we're family. We're in this. So anyway, that's what the pilgrims had.
I think it's inherent to being a human. I really do. I think that anyone, as part of this like woke agenda, I don't want to be too political, but it seems like hate has become normalized by one party in particular. And it's like, if we look back, if we pay close attention, I think we're hardwired to connect. And I think when we,
Paul talks about us being the body of Christ, and Jesus talks about that. And you think of it, every cell in your body is connected to a bunch of cells around it. It's not connected to every cell in the whole body, but it is closely connected to the dozen cells that are right around that cell. And it gets life through those other cells, right? And it's a give and take. And so every Christian needs to be a part of a small group, is my feeling. I mean, it need to be small enough so that people say, well, Taylor, what do you have to say about this? And you're like, oh, I get to give input. And then you find that you say something that actually helps people, and you're like, hey, and then they say, and it's the Holy Spirit uses. So you don't need to be friends with 1,000 people. You need just a small group, but everybody needs a small group. And any big church that's successful is successful because they've got a myriad of small groups inside of it where people can plug in.
There's authentic connection happening.
But anyway. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Truly, I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about all that you're doing, and let me know anything I can do to help. And if anybody wants me to come and speak, I'm more than happy to.
I think I'm going to try to make that happen. I don't know when or where, but I'm so thankful for this connection.
Yeah, and you've got my number, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, expect to hear from me again.
And let me...
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry to you, Bill.
I'm just going to go.
It does.
So that's your number?
That is exactly me. Perfect.
All right.
I'm fascinated by this as well.
And does that email look right?
Yes, exactly.
And did I forward you the Greg Winslow?
You did. I wanted to meet you first because I don't know.
They're really cool.
I bet.
I mean, he was a missionary in Mexico.
Okay.
And he was talking about how the gangs, they're driving down the road, the gang pulls over their van full of all their, I guess they had a youth bunch of people in there,
Oh wow.
and they have the guns. They make go down some road to a field. They make them all get out. They tie them behind their back. They make them kneel in a
Oh my
field.
gosh.
And he's like, okay,
What?
this is going to be one of those stories I read about where people get killed
No
by the gangs.
kidding.
And so he started just singing praise songs.
Oh wow.
And the gang leader's like, shut up. He's like, he just keeps singing a praise song. And the guy's like, shut up. He's like, just keep it. It's like, it's my life. I'm going to die. I'm going to decide how I'm going to die. He kept singing praise songs. The guy says, okay, fine. He unties them. He robs them all, puts them back in the van, gives them their keys, and says, get out of here and don't even look around. Don't ever come back.
Oh my God.
And it's like, you know.
And then he was trying not to like people believe, but that's their experience. So like how people can say that he believed his faith didn't save him.
I do think Christianity almost has a monopoly on stories like that, though. I'm like, I'm going to be honest. I feel like when I hear stories like that, it's you know, I might just, maybe that's just what I hear. But there's so much strength in it. I mean, because I can really imagine that. Like, I can imagine someone with a troubled heart hearing it and it like stirring their whole, you know what I mean? And just, all right.
Well, but I mean, I was with Greg and his wife. What's her name? For there was like an event up in Plymouth.
Okay.
And at that house I was telling you about.
The Winslow House? Or sorry, it's not the Plymouth Museum?
No, the Winslow, Greg and Suzanne Winslow. So that's his wife's name is Suzanne.
Okay, beautiful.
But it's the Jerry Pereira, P-E-R. He's the one that owns the house, that Leiden house. The one that is built on where the Pilgrims met, that their first building.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, Jerry and Beth Pereira. Yeah, he's like a big, tall guy from Indonesia, and he played basketball, and he did really well in the stock market.
Okay.
And he bought the house; it was for sale. But
That's amazing.
It's the oldest, house, continuous house in America, or something like that. Let's see, T-A-Y. So I'll forward you Jerry's number.
Oh, that's huge. Thank you.
But he loves showing people.